Hey guys, welcome back to the Casual NBA Fanatic podcast. Now, with the season almost here, I just wanted to talk about something that doesn't always show up in the box scores, and that is pressure. Every year, there are players who carry more weight than others, and whether that's proving that they can live up to their set expectations or chasing a title, silencing critics, or just keeping their franchise moving forward. And so in this episode, I'm going to be counting down my 5 players who I believe are under the most pressure heading into the 2025-26 NBA season. And so these are just the guys whose narratives could completely shift depending on how this year plays out. So let's get into it with my honorable mention, Ja Morant. Now, Ja's level of pressure stems from the amount of belief and trust that Memphis has continued to put into him. We've seen the coach firings from the recent few months, Taylor Jenkins obviously, and with Jenkins' firing, we can only assume that this was to do with really just Morant's level of discontent with Memphis' shift away from that heavy Ja pick and roll offensive system. And really just after the firing, we saw Memphis really lean heavily into that Morant high-dose pick-and-roll style of basketball, especially towards the back end of the season, despite the success that their drive and kick and that rapid relocation, the continuous advantage extending style of offense, all the offensive results that got them earlier in the year when they were a top 3 seed in the West prior to the Jenkins firing. And in the playoffs, we saw Memphis really just delve into that Ja Morant pick-and-roll game. He was taking 12.7 possessions a game, and that included a 15-minute performance in Game 3. So this guy was taking just under 13 possessions of pick and roll per game. But last season overall, though, for Ja, we did see a career low mark in actual pick and roll possessions per game throughout the regular season. He was attempting just 6.9 a game, and that was the first time in his career where he didn't hit around that 10 possession mark per game. But now with Memphis seeming to shift gears back towards that slower pace and less holistic Ja pick and roll type of offense, just the pressure on Ja Morant to deliver sustainable results and really strong offensive team results, it's absolutely sky high at this point. And the thing with leaning into any sort of heliocentric style of offense is that typically your level of matchup resilience as a team is fully dependent on your stars' level of matchup resilience. And with Ja, just the lack of offensive diversity, the lack of external impact and overall skill and shot touch, that just heavily diminishes his ability to thrive against real athletic and high-level pick-and-roll defenses like what we saw unfold in the first half of that OKC series before he got injured. And I just think Ja needs to prove himself of at least a top 25 player in the NBA today this season. And with the amount of demands that he has requested and the amount of demands that have been met by Memphis, who have been nothing but great to him, treating him like their franchise player for all of these years, I just think he needs to prove that he can lead this Memphis squad through to the postseason once again and actually show significant improvements in those vital offensive areas, which he has failed to do so over the first 6 years of his career. And that comes really just predominantly in the pull-up shooting aspect of things. And that comes especially if he is going to be a defensive liability for Memphis. He just needs to prove that he is a superior offensive and unstoppable rim pressuring talent who can float and create truly efficient team offense. And that's why the pressure really is on Ja Morant. Otherwise, Memphis might actually have to shift gears and look towards another franchise cornerstone if Ja Morant can't do anything of significance this upcoming season. Now, number 5, I have LaMelo Ball landing here. And LaMelo is in a similar position to Ja Morant. I think he's a guy that needs to prove that he is worthy of that franchise cornerstone dedication from his franchise. And like Morant, talent and upside is definitely there, and we've seen it for years upon years now. But LaMelo just hasn't weaponized and harnessed his gifts to a sufficient enough level that makes him worthy of fully building around. And he's actually lucky, in my opinion, that Charlotte have dedicated still these growing years around him. And obviously right now, LaMelo is just more of that fun, erratic basketball project. But he's someone that is yet to deliver true improvements in the winning impact department of things. We obviously see year by year just bad tendencies that just continually override everything good that he does bring to a team. We're talking about god-awful shot selection, just bombing threes from absurd distances, making erratic passes through overly tight spaces, just shots settling from every section on the floor. And really with Charlotte, they have seemed to try leaning on finding a true direction as of recently. I think the Hornets franchise must really be just sick of losing and playing this unserious brand of basketball. And it'll be interesting to see how LaMelo can translate his game before Charlotte actually lose ultimate interest in LaMelo. In the past few months, obviously, the Hornets have brought in mature guys and veterans like Con Knuppel, Colin Sexton, Spencer Dinwiddie, obviously rookies as well who are relatively experienced like Liam McNeely, Mason Plumlee they brought in as well. And it's really just this motivation to try and embed some competitive intensity into that locker room, which has been so unserious over the past few years. But ultimately, in LaMelo's case, in 5 years in a Charlotte jersey, he's just produced one season carrying the Hornets over 500 and just 2 play-in berths. And they haven't been above the 10 seed his entire tenure there. And LaMelo's only All-Star appearance was 3.5 years ago now. And obviously, I understand the injury history, but it is time to start to ramp up those results. He's 24 years old now, and obviously creativity and flair is unique, but it's no longer an attractive trait for leading a winning basketball team as he starts to enter the prime years of his career. But what does have me hesitant about LaMelo truly having a really significant year in 2026 is just the fact that he has yet to truly build out his frame, and he's also failed to develop those advantageous athletic traits as well. He still doesn't weaponize the agile frame and the size advantages that he has enough to create efficient go-to offense. And last season, he took just 21% of his looks at the rim, and he hasn't exactly proved of himself as this super reliable pull-up shot hunter. And he's actually had decreasing efficiency over the years as well, so we're actually not sure just how sustainable of a LaMelo offense even his ceiling can reach at this point in time. And as we see the trend with the actual premier lead point guards for championship level squads go, it's guys like Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Jalen Brunson, Tyrese Halliburton, Luka Doncic, Steph Curry. These are all guys that just present as much more reliable and consistent advantage creators who can lean on either the physical side of things or just the absurd talent and reaction-based sort of things. And so next year, for LaMelo, it's really just going to be proving that there is that level of consistent floor raising to his game and that he can feasibly lead a relatively decent team offense. Because at this point in time, he's really fallen behind the curve. And just looking at the actual Eastern Conference, he's already been overtaken by guys like Cade Cunningham and Tyler Hero in that mold of offensive generators. And so just bridging the gap between even guys like that and just proving of that efficient mindset, that's just going to be absolutely pivotal and next up for LaMelo to keep Charlotte's invested trust. And I think this year is a make or break year for LaMelo Ball to prove himself as a franchise cornerstone. Now, number 4, I've got New York's very own Karl-Anthony Towns. Now, Cat comes in here as the only guy I have who isn't his team's best player as such. But to me, Brunson has pulled his weight for sure, and he has proved of being a sufficient enough floor raiser to be the head of this championship level team. But on the other side of things, it's really just Cat as of last year who didn't prove enough of that winning impact to satisfy those championship hopes and aspirations for New York as the second lead guy for that New York team. But really for Cat, it wasn't just the actual inconsistency and the matchup dependence that he exhibited game to game in the postseason, but it stems more from just the lack of being able to satisfy any consistent defensive role as New York's anchor, and that does make him extremely detrimental when it comes to the hopes of hoisting the trophy in New York City. And now pitched as the 4-man now, he's going to be anticipated to play the power forward position next to Mitchell Robinson at the 5. I think New York are really just going to actively give Cat more cushion support in that defensive role. They're going to be allowing him to be in a role that is naturally less vulnerable to being pulled into action and just give him more room for error in that department. And with that, Cat just has to really run and continue his surging offensive impact that he brings to the floor as well. He's got to really prove that he can solidify himself as an offensive juggernaut, not just at the 5 position, but at the 4 position where he doesn't have the same speed advantages. And that really is just the question mark for Cat, and it's always been just the positional fit question. And as the 4-man, we've seen the best team results with Karl-Anthony Towns on a roster. But that does usually coincide with more of that lower end of individual dominance like we saw in those later years in Minnesota where he was next to Rudy Gobert, where just the spacing and the inability to get those easy dribble penetration lanes just hindered that overpowering offensive ceiling that he could bring to a team. But we saw prior to the Gobert trade and also with what we saw last season in New York, we've seen just how individually dominant Cat's individual offensive value is when he is playing that 5-man position. But ultimately, that was one of the major holes that got New York more or less pummeled in that conference finals versus that pristine Pacers squad. But now looking on to this season, now that he is going to be given an alternative role, I just think it'll be so interesting to see how Cat can blend between giving that immense offensive punch whilst not having all the mobility and downhill momentum advantage that he typically gets against other centers. And he is a veteran now, and he's got a ton of experience behind him, but it's really just time to put it to work. And he's never been in a better position to hoist the trophy than this year. And so Cat does land here as someone I view as under extreme pressure to protect and build his basketball legacy this season as he does approach 30 years old in the dead heat of his prime, with arguably the best roster that he's ever had. And there are simply no excuses for not delivering at least a finals appearance for New York this season for Karl-Anthony Towns. Now, moving on to number 3, this pick is a bit more subjective in my opinion, and I have Nikola Jokic landing here at number 3. Now, with Nikola Jokic, the reason why I think it's subjective is that this guy's literally achieved everything that there is to accomplish in his career, and he has already cemented himself as one of the all-time great talents that the league has ever seen. But for me, he isn't just someone who is going to be viewed as a top 25 player of all time. Legitimately, this guy has the chance to chuck himself into that top 10 zone, and these years are really what are going to be the make or break years for what may be one of the greatest legacies the sports world has ever seen. And since his 2023 NBA title, we've seen Jokic in 2 losses in the second round and experiencing relatively inconsistent playoff performances relative to his standard, especially in that Minnesota series that they lost in 2024 and obviously just last season against OKC. But now with the most talented roster that Jokic has ever graced on, expectations are now sky high for him. And Denver are probably the title favorite, if not second, with the roster changes that Denver's made to commit to this season being the one to repeat a second title with this franchise. And what adds to the expectation scale is really just the perception across the league on Nikola Jokic. Nikola right now is undoubtedly acknowledged as the best player in the world, and he has been for the past 3 seasons now. And it is time to look beyond the astronomical regular season success. And if Jokic really wants to carve out this all-time legendary status amongst the basketball world, he needs to really start adding titles to his resume. And Denver have given up a ton of their future for this particular roster to perfectly complement Jokic. And they've committed to him in a way that just allows for sustainable roster construction, just not giving in to bringing in short-term, high-risk superstar partners, but more building a cohesive and continual threat. And Jokic going into next season has absolutely no excuses to not hoist the trophy now that people are throwing him in top 15 all-time discussions already now with only 1 title on his resume. And so basically, just considering the public consensus surrounding Jokic and just how glorified and respected his profile has become, another title on Jokic's resume will keep the notion rolling. And that's why I do have him here in my top 3 players of who does have the most pressure heading into next season. Now, number 2, I've got Trae Young from the Atlanta Hawks. And reasons why Trae Young lands here so high on this list is exactly similar to Ja Morant and LaMelo Ball. And it's really just that skill guard and that lead guard position is just so hard to lead a franchise as. And the amount of skill, the amount of shot diversity, the cognitive processing and the physical advantages that you need is absolutely absurd. And that's why we've seen many of these prospects fall as franchise cornerstones. In recent history, we've had guys like Kyrie Irving with Boston, Kemba Walker with the Charlotte Hornets, Damian Lillard with Portland, and even Devin Booker with Phoenix, and that tenure may even end soon as well. And it's just so immensely hard to be the best player on a championship team as a skill-based, shot-making orientated guard. But Atlanta remain tied to Trae Young and his overall box creation talent, and he is one of the most prolific mass shot creators in the league, just with that heavy dose of mismatch attacking with the speed, the pull-up leverage, the downhill speed, and the nimble frame that he can weaponize to get those patented floaters. But really just what unlocks everything for Trae and what makes him so incredible as a floor-raising and ultimately just heliocentric prospect is the overall passing chops. Last year, Trae Young averaged 12 assists a game, and he's got a 10 assist career average. And that really just speaks to the knack of being able to open up such a high volume of passing windows with the scoring threat that he continually poses. And he is just 6'1" and he is relatively skinny. But despite that, Trae can really make those high leverage reads around traffic. He's so skilled and daring with his skip reads, those kick-out feeds to spot-up shooters, just pushing transition pace, just feeding the paint off the roll and finding those tiny cracks and crevices to reward those backline cutters. And he's just an overall offensive wizard with what he can do at his size. Really, the only thing is that Atlanta hasn't seen enough in the results category so far in Trae's career, and that's where the pressure does stem and really start to ramp up, especially this season. And obviously, he has delivered one conference finals appearance, and that was in 2021. But besides that, Trae has failed to even just get this team to the first round in the past 2 seasons. And obviously, this isn't solely Trae's fault. I mean, obviously, Atlanta's front office has done a really bad job in terms of the roster construction department, just lacking so much roster diversity, especially in that front line as well. Obviously, we've seen inconsistent teammate health between guys like Jalen Johnson and DeJounte Murray, and that has denied him a sustainable environment to churn out a winning culture. But now with the drastic changes that Atlanta has made to give Trae by far his most talented roster, I just think all the attention and expectations for Trae to deliver in a weak Eastern Conference is absolutely sky high once again. Obviously, the Hawks, in the past few months, they've brought in his most talented teammate that he's ever graced the floor with, and that is Kristaps Porzingis, a guy that just adds to the frontline diversity, another guy who can create in the half court efficiently, especially out of that post-up game and out of the roll man touches from the elbow. Atlanta also brought in Nickeil Alexander-Walker, a 3-and-D wing with substantially more perimeter skill and shot making than Dyson Daniels. And they've also signed Luke Kennard, just another guy that adds true spacing to a lineup that still has inconsistent perimeter execution, especially when it comes to the spot-up scoring. And so when projecting Atlanta to the rest of the East, they actually have a real chance to compete for a top 3 seed if they can stay healthy. Obviously, regular season success is nice, but it shouldn't be just the success grader for this team. I think the Atlanta Hawks should have real finals aspirations heading into next season, and those are extremely valid for a team with the talent that they have relative to their conference competition. And for Trae Young, I mean, just proving that he can box create at a regular season juggernaut level and just proving that there is still room for heliocentric basketball in a winning championship level context, that is going to be a huge factor for Trae to see if he can assert himself as an all-time franchise legend in Atlanta Hawks history. Obviously, though, we know with Trae Young, there are a ton of drawbacks with him being your offensive generator, and that kind of just stems from the fact that he is pretty inefficient as a scorer. There are some very questionable shot selection marks and very dicey ball security and overall decision-making chops to him. But if there's any year to fully rein in and produce offense at the level that we know he is capable of, it's definitely this year for Trae, especially with all eyes pointed on him with this refined Atlanta roster and maybe the best Atlanta Hawks roster that we've seen since 2016. And if Trae can't put together something of significance this season, it may be time to start looking at trade options for Trae or packaging for another true superstar and backseat Trae as a second option in this league. Now, number 1, the player that I believe to have the utmost pressure weighing upon him is Luka Doncic. But with Luka, the pressure really isn't as much to exactly win a title, but it's more just a proof of the megastar standard that he truly is capable of. With Luka being basically discarded by Dallas and disregarded as a franchise cornerstone type of talent after everything that he had achieved prior to being traded from Dallas, just the revenge tour for Luka is going to be one of the most anticipated storylines of this upcoming season, and anything below a similar stat line of something like 30, 10, and 10 basically misses the expectations that the media and the public have for him after the entire offseason, basically just showing us the pure shredding and the physique polishing that he has absolutely gone through and committed to. And with Luka, we know all the tools that he brings as probably the second best offensive player in basketball. We're talking about one of the most overpowered pick-and-roll ball handlers that the league has ever seen, an unbelievable isolation scorer, elite coverage beater, insanely developed visionary, paired with tons of strength in his packed frame as well. He's also got the elite reaction-based tools to manipulate any defender and any defensive coverage. And so when reviewing just how much we expect a more chiseled version of Luka to perform, considering LA's urgency to post a championship level sort of season, especially with LeBron's expiring years, It's really just that if Luka doesn't get to that 2024 level of individual dominance, he simply hasn't hit the bar this season for our expectations. And part of Luka's actual legacy will be strongly dictated by the outcomes of this season, especially as we do look to just how aggressive and switched on that he aims to be, especially with the amount of fueling motivation that he still has, especially after being shipped off and basically written off from the talent that he is supposed to be. And that trade was absolutely personal for Luka, but now it's time for Luka to get his get back by leveling up to a standard that we haven't yet seen before. And this season is the most likely to do so. And I just believe Luka Doncic will really put on full display of the all-time great talent that he is. And so that wraps up my list of the players under the most pressure. My honorable mention was Ja Morant. And then my top 5 are LaMelo Ball, Karl-Anthony Towns, Nikola Jokic, Trae Young, and Luka Doncic at number 1. Each of these guys is facing a different kind of weight, and whether it's proving themselves on a bigger stage, carrying championship expectations, or just showing that they can still elevate their teams to the very top, all of these guys are under enormous pressure under the media and public consensus. The 2025-26 season is really just going to be the season that these 6 guys really truly define their narratives and legacies in such a dramatic way. But now I want to hear from you guys and your takes. Let me know, did I get this list right? And who else do you think deserves to be under that sort of spotlight this year? Hit me up at Casual NBA Fanatic and we'll get into some heated debates there. Thanks for tuning in, and make sure you're following the podcast so you don't miss the next episode as we get closer to tip-off.